All right, so as folks are joining and tuning in, on the Instagram Live, what you are going to be able to see is the workshop participants, people who will be facilitating conversation today. What you aren't going to be able to see are our slides because this format doesn't allow for that. So if you want to see those, what you would want to do is click on the link in our bio and head over to the Zoom webinar where those slides will be visible to you. Also, the video that's going to be on the webinar or happening through the webinar format on Zoom, that is going to be available in a few days online. And so it will be an ongoing and continuing resource available for folks. So my name is Chava, and I'm joining you from Arizona, or so-called Arizona. And I just want to kind of welcome people and also set a tone for this time that we've taken out of the day to talk about movement defense and repression and anti-repression efforts. This workshop is something that folks who are part of this today developed years ago with other social movements in mind and other moments in mind, but also with the idea that it could be an ongoing resource for people that was adaptable to new contexts and different moments in time and different needs. And so that's what's happened over the years since it was put together as a curriculum, is that a lot of different people have contributed to it over time and shaped it for what their needs were in their particular political and social context. And our hope is that that continues to be the case, right? This is just a foundational curriculum that then can be adapted for different moments. And it's not information or knowledge that any of the people you're going to hear from today have any kind of monopoly over. It's knowledge that actually has been gifted to us by movement elders and by people who participated in social and political movements for liberation over many, many decades. And we wouldn't be able to share this information if it wasn't for those people who've gifted that to all of us in this moment. And we really feel that it's our responsibility to make sure that we continue to share that information. And you're going to be hearing from a few different folks. We have a good comrade who's going to share from STARC, which is Scuffletown Anti-Repression Committee in Richmond, Virginia. And they're going to request to hop in here on the Instagram Live. And that'll take just a second.
Hi, I'm Em. I am talking to y'all from Richmond, Virginia, or so-called Richmond, Virginia, and representing the Scuffletown Anti-Repression Committee, along with my comrade Elle.
Hi y'all, my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm here with the Richmond Community Bail Fund.
And I'm just going to start off by giving an overview of how the presentation is going to go. So today we're going to start out by talking a little bit about what repression is. We're going to try and see if we can do audience participation in this virtual format. And then we'll be talking about collective action, social movement theory, and how social movements coalesce and how we act together. We'll talk a little bit about the tools that the state has and the tools that we have as well in order to understand repression and understand the ways that we fight back against repression. We'll also give a quick abridged history of the very, very long history of the repression of social movements and of social movements in the US specifically. And then we'll finish up with a case study of anti-repression from more recent years, and we'll do a little bit of question and answer. So yeah, I'm just going to repeat a little bit of what Chava's already shared, since we have people coming in and out all the time, but to share a little bit about us. We want to recognize that the people giving this presentation at the moment are people who experience the world through whiteness and white bodies, and we want to share that we're also people who participate in social movements and have for many years. And we have learned everything that we're sharing here from past movements, from other people who engage in this work and do this. And so we don't have a monopoly on any of this information. This is information that we believe should be widely shared, held, passed on. And we think that this is this is important for all struggles. And from our political perspective, we speak from a position of wanting to see every person free, and liberation for all social movements. Sorry, I have to plug my charger in briefly. Okay, so yeah, we're speaking from a perspective that is, for full abolition of the entities that repress us, the state, the police, prisons, etc. So just a quick disclaimer, we're not lawyers. Nothing that we say here should be construed as legal advice. And if you have a specific legal question, you should speak to an attorney, and we might be able to connect you with resources in your area that have attorneys. Again, there's question and answer options for both Instagram and Zoom. So just to say, we're talking a little bit about sensitive topics, because state violence is violent, but we're not going to be speaking about graphic violence in any way, and we're open to feedback, receptive to it. We like to hear from y'all. And also, state repression is basically, it's an everyday normal experience for vast numbers of people, and it's not an exceptional thing. But here we're focusing on the repression of social movements specifically, because in the histories of social movements, there are ways that they have traditionally been repressed and traditionally fought back against repression. Yeah. So some things might feel like obvious of how we resist the state and the efforts to quell our movements and make us be quiet and go home. So we never talk to cops or law enforcement. We do jail support when our friends get arrested. We share know your rights information to people at demos. So these are kind of the basics, but we're gonna go into a little bit more depth of why we do these things, the power that it can give us. And yeah, we're gonna start with attempting audience participation. So this is gonna be a little bit experimental. So if y'all want to throw out things to help us create and craft a shared definition of repression, you can send them into the Q&A fields now.
Well, I'm going to get us started. I'm going to say the police in neighborhoods.
And we have someone who said school systems in the Zoom. Okay, anything else we can think of?
I think of lawsuits. The court system.
We have revisionist histories that are taught to us, surveillance and phone culture. Yeah, these are all really good, parts of the really vast, cloud of things that make up repression. It could look like the inability to be openly Jewish, Muslim, anything that isn't Christian in this country. The state limiting a person's civic and human rights to prevent or coerce the stop of activity that's politically unpopular. Great. Y'all are doing great. Okay, so we're gonna talk about repression, a shared definition that people who have worked on this presentation have come up with, which is the process by which the preconditions for dissident action, mobilization, and collective organization are inhibited by either raising their costs or reducing their benefits. So a couple other things people said were the over-policing of poor and Black folks, algorithms that control information we see, over-medication. Again, all great. But we're going to talk specifically about how the state neutralizes the challenges to its political authority, and any forms of organization, mobilization, movement, action that challenge its monopoly of violence, its monopoly over the control of lives, and yeah. So the state does repress, exercises its ability to repress by making things more taxing on our resources. So us being social movements and those who are fighting for liberation, and speaking to this moment specifically, the total liberation and freedom for Black people in the United States and beyond. And they want to reduce our impact and our ability to be beneficial and to give to those around us. So it can be a response to a crisis or trying to preserve the normalcy, like normal state of affairs. But it always is something that's serving to limit our ability to act, to talk about politics, to do politics, and to resist like politics as normal. It's constant and continuing reaction to movements at fight for a new world or for radical change. So while the degree of repression might change based on what's going on, we understand that some level of repression is always present, and we don't seek to avoid repression. We believe that repression can't be avoided, and actually we just want to focus on how we respond to and challenge it. No matter how we act, if we're fighting for a different world, there's going to be repression present. So that's a really important like core concept that underlies a lot of what we're sharing here, is that we can't resist repression in total, and so we're just understanding that and incorporating that into how we act. Yeah, and so when we anticipate and expect repression, and we know the history of our movements and how they've traditionally resisted repression, we can be more resilient, we can be like more powerful together, and then we won't be paralyzed by repression, by people having to go to court. We'll be prepared for it, and yeah, we might even like win in the face of the state. It's possible, it happens. And in an ideal situation, facing repression connects us to each other, gives us new opportunities to be stronger and to fight back. And I'm gonna pass this along to the discussion of preconditions for collective action.
I'm Jay, I'm in Texas. Part of what Em was talking about is sort of how repression, operates on our movements. And so in order to think about that and sort of understand that, I found it helpful to think about, what do our movements actually need to be effective and to be successful? And then from there, sort of understanding, which parts of these different types of repression tend to attack. And so I actually sort of stole this 6-point framework directly out of a book, and then kind of elaborated on it a little bit. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's really useful for understanding, the theory of how movements work, the things that they need. And the book called it 6 Preconditions for Collective Action. I call it 6 things that movements need to keep going. The first one is maintaining the solidarity, morale, and commitment of the participants. This is, current participants, people that are organizing, the organizations themselves, the communities that form the base of these movements. I think the counterpoint to this is what we sometimes refer to as burnout. The sense of being exhausted, or the inability to keep moving forward with the movement, things of that sort. The other aspect of it is this idea of solidarity, that it's not just how we feel personally, but it's how we feel in relation and how we act in relation to one another, both as individuals, organizations, and communities. Attracting new participants. Obviously, the more people that become involved, the better. I think the other aspect of this is not just creating new participants, but creating new connections between people that are already involved. So creating, larger networks, new alliances between groups, creating sort of coalitions, or, what the business world would call synergy, to amplify our impact in what we're doing. Number 3, creating, nurturing, and supporting the leadership or empowerment of people involved. When I say leadership, I don't necessarily mean sort of command and control or authority over other people, but more leadership in the sense of, inspiration, providing education and mentorship, providing, concrete organizing skills so that people can increase their participation, increase the level of things that they can do as part of the movement, basically sort of increasing the capacity of each participant and the movement as a whole. Number 4 in this framework is generating favorable media coverage. I think this is maybe a little bit out of date. The way that media has shifted, the new emphasis on social media, texting, emails, things of that sort, I think have in some ways diminished the importance of generating favorable media coverage. You can have an action that gets publicized and gets attraction sort of organically without CNN or the local paper ever covering it. And in some ways, I think that some of those organizations are struggling to keep up with how society moves. On the other hand, I don't think that those, larger media entities are completely irrelevant. I do think that they help shape dialogue and sort of shape public participation about the movement. And so being able to craft an image or engage with those in a way can be extremely important to social movements, especially in relation to number 5, which is mobilizing support for sympathetic bystanders. It's sort of this idea that in any organization, any movement, any sort of collective entity, there's people on different sides. You've got the really hardcore, very active participants. You've got people that are sort of less active. You've got people that are sympathetic but maybe never get particularly active individually. And then on the other side, you've got people that are maybe like neutral or maybe a little bit hostile but never do anything. And then on the far end, people that are extremely hostile. And so the idea is that there's a lot of support that we get from people that are kind of in this sympathetic but not extremely active middle portion. And so being able to mobilize support for them, whether it's donations, whether it's occasional labor, whether it's a media share on social media, they might still come to a fundraiser, donate money or supplies, things of that sort. The sort of occasional participation can make the huge difference because, and I think some of this will get talked about later, but sometimes we feel like we're trying to raise money for something and we're just passing around the same $20 bill to all our organizations. And so having influx of resources and energy that are coming from people that maybe aren't going to join your collective or join your direct action group, but still might, throw you some support, throw you some food, the ones that, order pizza down to your encampment, things like that. And then number 6 on this list of preconditions is carving out tactical freedom to pursue the goals of the movement. This is sort of counterposed with defensive measures such as, bailing people out of jail, mounting a legal defense, kicking informants out of groups, things of that sort. There's this idea in both political and even in some like military struggles that the advantage isn't necessarily accruing to the side that's like physically or materially strongest, but advantage goes to the side that is able to capture and maintain the initiative. And there's a lot of discussion both on the sort of repression side and also on the movement side about what it takes and what it means to retake the initiative in these situations. And some of what I think it's really important to think about is in our anti-repression strategies, what are things that we can do that retake the initiative, take the initiative away from the police, from the government, from the corporations, from whoever it is that we're facing this repression from, so that we're the ones that have the momentum, we're the ones that are sort of calling the shots and that they're reacting to us instead of us simply reacting to them. I think the other piece about sort of this 6 preconditions for collective action that I think is really important is the idea that a lot of our anti-repression strategies are not necessarily what we do in relation to the state, in relation to the police, in relation to the military or whatever, a lot of our anti-repression strategies are sort of internal to our movement, to our organizations. It's how we interact and relate to each other, how we maintain our solidarity, how we, continue to teach and empower people, how we, create the tactical freedom and the initiative to keep fighting for our freedom and our liberation. And this is something that has sort of been an evolution of my thinking about anti-repression, but it's something that a friend of mine calls relational security. This idea that like you can encrypt all of your communications and you can practice good, security culture, as they say. But if the person that you trust is not who they say they are, if they're disingenuous, if people are feeling guilted into doing things that they're maybe not comfortable with doing, if people are actually sort of fighting for two different things, even though maybe they sound similar, that can create a lot of discord, a lot of danger. And so this idea that building strong relationships within our community, really knowing and understanding the people that we organize with and that we struggle with, makes us a lot stronger and a lot more resilient in the face of various types of repression. It allows us to work through conflicts that are inevitably going to rise. And it allows us to, maintain solidarity with each other, even if we don't necessarily always like each other or agree with each other, that we're still able to, respect one another and sort of acknowledge our shared commitment to the same visions, the same goals, and see our joint stake in what we're doing. And so I think it's important, a lot of anti-repression stuff sort of devolves into like how to encrypt your emails and how to not use social media. But I think a bigger portion of our conversations need to focus on, what are we doing internally with each other? What kind of relationships are we building? And how can we build those relationships stronger? And so I'm incredibly grateful for the people that I've had those conversations with that have sort of imparted, their perspective and their wisdom that's helped sort of shape my thinking about it also.
So what I love about the way that we're trying to frame repression inside of this discussion is that it is, ever present, it's unavoidable, and it's going on pretty much all the time. And because of that, I think sometimes we don't do as good of a job as we can identifying how that pops up or what that looks like. And so for this section, we're just going to break down some of the state tools and some of our tools as well, which of course we have many more tools than them, right? And so for this particular discussion, we're going to chop it up into 4 categories. Of course, there are a lot of people who interpret the tools of the state apparatus in many different ways. But for the purpose of today, we'll be talking about it in terms of physical violence, the legal apparatus or the criminal punishment system, surveillance, and what we would call social mapping, which is when the state identifies, who rolls with who and whose crews are friends and what kind of work do they do together. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about media and information management. So I'd like to start with the physical violence piece, and I'd like to ask y'all on Zoom with us, when I say the state uses physical violence for repression, what are some of those tactics or techniques? And I'm just going to give y'all about a minute to throw some of those in the chat. When asking the audience, what tools of the state fall under the physical violence category, I'm seeing riot cops, SWAT, other tactical teams, absolutely. Policies that lead to mass incarceration, blocking people into protests so they can't leave, absolutely. Excessive policing in marginalized communities, military tactics to suppress protesting, okay, y'all are going off, intimidation, instigation, kettling, tear gas, stop and frisk, more folks talking about incarceration, some physical violence against protesters. Okay, y'all are amazing. You're getting ahead of me. So we're gonna slow down a little bit. But yeah, absolutely. All of those are examples of the ways that the state uses physical violence. Some things that maybe we don't talk about as often is property destruction, right, or the theft of property from folks, as well as like all the way at the end of the spectrum to like assassination, right? And using physical intimidation, creating trauma as well, is a way that the state is violent towards folks engaging in social movement. Something else that I want to name is that we know the state collaborates with fascist groups, right, with white supremacist groups. And that's, you know, that's one of the ways that we use our tools to combat that specific tool of the state. We expose very explicitly the collaboration between the state and white supremacist groups or fascist groups. Jail support is another great example that Em mentioned earlier on. De-arrests that, you know, I think a lot of us have seen videos, most recently out of, I think it was New Orleans, right? Like, of folks refusing to allow the state to perform an arrest, which isn't always safe, of course, but sometimes does work. Kicking tear gas back. We've seen a lot of videos of that happening. And, you know, that kind of one-to-one moment, you throw tear gas at us, we're going to throw it right back, right? And also, of course, destroying the state's property as well, another one-to-one moment when we respond to that. The next kind of grouping of tools that we're talking about, some folks already started to hit on, but I want to invite y'all to continue to send in some examples of how the state uses the legal apparatus, or what we might call the criminal punishment system, to perform repression against folks engaging with abolition or social movement. And I'll give y'all about 60 seconds. Okay.
Being on paper. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Probation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing minimum sentencing, trumped up charges, really good one. Grand juries as well. The planting of evidence. Okay.
Any kind of confinement.
Oh yeah. Okay. Any kind of confinement. Yeah, especially if we're thinking about solitary, right, as well, as a specific tool. Excessive charges, high bonds, petty charges. Absolutely. Selective enforcement of laws, for sure, often race-based, class-based, right? Cops never being held accountable, Delaying court dates to build cases against the people. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so these are all wonderful examples and exactly what we're trying to get at here. And so, you know, something that I want to touch on is specific laws that are crafted by the state to target anyone existing in tension with it, right? Specific targets, specifically targeting social movements as well. And, you know, folks are naming this in different ways, but malicious prosecution, right, as well. And then, like y'all were saying, grand juries and trumped up charges. Really feels like y'all got a handle on this one, and all of them probably. I want to highlight some of the ways that we respond to that, right? So court support. Court support is a great way that our community kind of quickly responds to one of the state's very specific tools inside of the criminal punishment system. Court solidarity as well. Obstruction is another way. And, you know, we have read stories of folks who, because of their community support, were able to resist grand juries, right? And that's another kind of that one-to-one. Okay, you pull me in for a grand jury, well, I'm not going to talk. Kind of one of our cornerstone tools in anti-repression is not speaking to the state or engaging with that. And, you know, sharing our legal resources, right? Like when we build a team of attorneys to help us get through our own individual experiences of repression, we then share that with our folks. We don't gatekeep that. We're sharing all the resources that we have to be able to navigate state repression. Awesome. I'm looking to see, okay. I think I got y'all.
Collective defense.
Collective defense, yeah, absolutely, as one of our tools, right? One of us is all of us. I'm also seeing door knocks as a way that this particular grouping of repression shows up. And yeah, of course, designating certain social movement groups as terrorists, kind of a classic tool of the state, absolutely. And I think that kind of blends into our next section, our next grouping, right? Which is surveillance, and the term that we use is social mapping. To break that down a little bit, that's when the state uses their surveillance to be able to determine who rolls with who and whose crews do what, and in what ways, right? And so I'm asking y'all, how does the state specifically use surveillance to perform repression? Where does that pop up? What are those tactics? Scraping social media, yeah, for sure. Undercover agents, drones at actions and smartphone pics, absolutely. Going after leaders of movements, Partnering with big tech orgs to keep and have access to all of our data, yeah, absolutely.
I want to hop in and add one. So we
Please.
talk a lot about the agent provocateur who tries to get people to do something, but I think lots of us have seen, I like to call it agent wet blanket, which just keeps you from ever accomplishing your goals and causes, like, disruption can oftentimes look interpersonal and not just in these more glam ways we think of from like cop shows.
Right.
We have Facebook groups and Twitter bots. So sowing political dissent via bot.
Yeah, paying people, informants for providing info, the good protester, bad protester narrative, right? To kind of also sow that dissent and that infighting. And then fear of surveillance, keeping newcomers out of movement, absolutely. Yeah, so y'all are really hitting it. I think kind of a major piece here is that creation of and the exacerbation and exploiting of divisions, infiltration that's happening, wiretaps, yeah, the provocateur that Chava was mentioning, spreading rumors and psyops. I saw somebody earlier in a different category say snitch jacketing, which I think falls in here, of course, like accusing folks. Harassment and questioning, right. And some of our kind of one-to-ones there, this is where, you know, our kind of the expansion or the expansiveness of our tools is really evident and really beautiful. One of those that Jay mentioned earlier is that relational security, right? I don't share something with you just because I love you and trust you and want you to know what's going on with me. I only share it with you if you're involved in that or immediately need to know about that, right? And counter surveillance. You scrape our social media, we scrape yours. You take photos of us at actions, we take photos of y'all at actions, right? We're also building databases or building intel, right, about how the state moves in each of our regions. Or, you know, a training like this, for example, of educating each other on what this looks like and how it pops up. And another that I think we're discussing a lot right now is obscuring our identity, right? Moving in a group and looking similar and being indiscernible from one another. I saw somebody say, you know, chasing after leaders. I think another way that we avoid this is by building a movement without leaders, right? Building a movement where everybody has the skills and tools. And if somebody needs to step back or does experience more violent repression, the movement keeps moving. So for our last category here, I'm gonna ask y'all to brainstorm with me. We're talking about media and information management. As Jay mentioned, you know, that looks different now. It presents itself differently. But when I say the state uses media and information management to repress social movements, what are the examples of that? Oh yeah, when they do X. And I'm looking for those in Zoom and on our Instagram.
Trump's Twitter.
Trump's Twitter. Absolutely. Fear-mongering, for sure.
Fits here too.
Yeah, absolutely. Capitalist tech orgs and companies as agent of the state. Yeah, Facebook, Google, etc. Yeah, we're seeing Amazon be like, oh, we aren't going to let y'all use our facial recognition technology for now. Ugly anarchists, right? Biased news outlets, social media doxing, selective coverage, state supporting narratives, reformist memes, selective coverage, pushing specific narratives again, posturing to discourage action, absolutely. Trashing the victims of police violence and killings, releasing mugshots, for sure. Democrats performing allyship to quiet people down, LOL, exactly. and the complete falsification of information on all mainstream media outlets. Yeah, everybody's hitting on the same page, right? The idea of media as the mouthpiece for the state, with the state having total control over the information that's shared to the public. And I think there are some really specific ways that we're really, really good at this now. One of them being social media, right? We are sharing information directly. We're creating the information, and you can see exactly who created that, right? You can track that down, who's sharing that or where that's coming from. And we can curate our information sources from people that we trust, who we know in movement, who we trust the information that they're sharing with us. And so not only curating what we use as trusted information, but creating that as well. And creating our own media sources. There are a ton of rad independent media sources that are on the ground covering what's happening. So we don't only have Democracy Now! to kind of get the info that we're looking for. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up Tools of the State. I just wanna remind y'all that we're more powerful than them. And I wanna ask if anybody wants to throw anything in that I didn't hit on before I pass it back to Chava, is that right? Yes. Anybody?
We have in the Instagram comments just a long live Amy. May Amy survive COVID-19. I'm with you, Genius Boy 123.
Yeah, we have spreading fear through social media, mostly towards young, vulnerable, queer people. Digital protest suppression, so like pushing, like changing, like hashtags, cutting people off social media. That was shared by a couple of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's a discussion about a recent situation in which there were black blocs all over Instagram when we sometimes access the work of the state for them, but that's for another discussion and another training. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Al. That was so great. And thank you for all the people that are participating on both of these platforms. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of resistance and also a history of repression. We, as humans right now in this moment where it feels like for the first time in my adult life, the United States has a real possibility of just like total insurrection. And I've always hoped, like fingers crossed we'd get there. And here we are in that moment where so many people are rising up. But that is not just happening in this moment, right? We're part of this long, continuous thread that goes back hundreds of years and really time immemorial in this country, on this land that we are living on, that's occupied territories. There is this like time immemorial history of resistance. But as powerful as our histories of resistance and those legacies that we draw from are, the state has its histories of repression and those legacies of repression that they pass down to one another as well, right? We have our movement elders and they have their shitbag elders. And we wanna know their history as much as we know our own, because that makes us stronger in resistance, right? It makes us more ready to fight back. So we're gonna go through what I have called like just a quick and dirty history of resistance and repression over the last 200 years. It's not gonna be in 2 minutes. If you're looking on the Zoom, it says in 2 minutes. Sometimes I do it in 2 minutes, but I'm gonna give myself a little more time today. So basically the repression that people are experiencing right now, even this thing where Trump is designating Antifa as a terrorist organization, this isn't new. This is part of a long pattern that the state has of these types of tactics. And so I'm not gonna go through all of these particular things on the bullet points on the Zoom right now, but some of these examples are the Alien and Sedition Acts of the 1800s, the labor movement, which utilized strike-breaking, infiltration of unions, execution of anarchists and other radicals. And then also in World War I, there were additional sedition acts. There were the Palmer raids in the 1910s through 20s, and then the Red Scare and House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1930s through 60s. And that resulted, the last time that anarchists were getting so much attention from the President of the United States that resulted in mass deportation of anarchists, communists, socialists out of this country into other countries. That's also where the origins of many of our current immigration laws are, is rooted in a targeting of political dissidents in this country who had come from Southern and Eastern Europe and brought with them radical politics in the communist, anarchist, and socialist vein. And so the United States government also has a history of using immigration law as a tool of repression of political movements and social resistance. I'm going to highlight just a few specific examples of histories of state repression. So COINTELPRO, I think a lot of people have heard of that. It was a program of the FBI, and it means it's a shorthand for counterintelligence program. And really what the FBI was trying to do under, if you're on the Zoom, there's a picture of this ugly mug, and that's J. Edgar Hoover. And what he was trying to do was, in his own words, in the FBI's own words, in leaked documents, that were found by anti-war activists, he said that the goal of COINTELPRO was protecting national security, preventing violence, maintaining the existing social and political order. And how were they going to do it? They were going to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize. Otherwise neutralize, I guess, is FBI shorthand for things as extreme as assassination. So what were the tactics of COINTELPRO? They were things like blackmail, harassment arrests, misinformation, burglaries, informants, provocateurs, and like I mentioned, assassination. If you're on the Zoom, there's some images here that pull from FBI documents that targeted the Black Panther Party and also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In particular, used this tool of blackmail was used in the 1960s against civil rights activists like Dr. King. And now we can say that many of these things that happened, these techniques that were used under COINTELPRO, there's a quote in the Zoom, it says, many of the techniques used would be intolerable in a democratic society, even if all of the targets had been involved in violent activity. But COINTELPRO went far beyond that. The Bureau conducted a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. They were not just targeting people who they deemed as violent, but also infiltrating groups like radical feminist reading groups and peaceful protester organizations around the Vietnam War, etc. One thing to note is that most of these tactics at the time that COINTELPRO, the FBI, was utilizing were illegal, but most of those are now legal for the federal government to use as a result of the Patriot Act following 9/11. And there are a lot of different legacies that we have of repression. One I want to dig into a little bit more in this moment is the repression specifically of the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s. So I think it's useful to look at this because it was a mass movement with a lot of different indigenous communities coming together in one location on the Pine Ridge, in the Pine Ridge area in Lakota Territory. And in 1973, not only were the FBI and the ATF and other federal and local law enforcement agencies using some of these things that we think of, that we just talked about with COINTELPRO, but they were also just using things in excess like traffic stops, targeted traffic stops, which we've also seen being used repeatedly in these movements over the last 5 to 10 years against police violence in this country, right? They know that you're a part of organizing in your local community and that your car, it has been marked in some way, and people just start racking up over and over traffic stops, right? And that was used by the ATF, FBI, and local law enforcement against the American Indian movement really effectively. But they also used misinformation, snitch jacketing, informants, provocateurs, and direct violence, including the use of the military, and also using tribal authorities that, especially on Pine Ridge, were particularly corrupt, but using people who looked like the people in struggle to gain legitimacy in their tactics of repression, which we also see echoed in these moments right now in a movement for Black liberation and against police murder and violence. I'm going to skip ahead a couple of decades to the early 2000s. Some people have heard of the Green Scare, which is a reference to this Red Scare I mentioned earlier, but it was really targeting, the FBI was targeting animal rights and eco and land liberation and defense movements. So people who are interested in environmental or animal issues particularly. Some people have heard of the Earth Liberation Front, the Animal Liberation Front, and they were certainly at those loose organizations or kind of banners of people doing particular direct action were certainly targeted, but as were people just doing work as mainstream as like PETA when it comes to animal liberation or animal rights activism. At the same time that animal rights activists and environmental activists were deemed the highest domestic terrorist threat in this country in the 1990s, we also simultaneously saw white nationalists building their movement of power and enacting major acts of terrorism like the Oklahoma City bombing. And yet they were not listed at that time. The focus of the United States government's law enforcement apparatus was on people fighting for animal liberation and rights and for the liberation of the earth, which I think is important to note, right? Also, because that continues to be the case today. Today, anti-fascists, anarchists are the target of the government's ire and their law enforcement and legal apparatus at the same time as we're seeing white nationalists and white supremacists engage in acts of disparate violence and terrorism. In the early 2000s, late 90s, probably most famously, people remember Seattle in 1999 with the World Trade Organization protests that happened and riots that occurred, and Black Bloc came into, for the first time, the popular imagination and conversation for Americans, for people in the United States. But what changed about policing in that moment was this thing that is called the Miami model, which is a reference to the 2003 FTAA protests in Miami. And what they did there with their local law enforcement was highly militarized, overwhelming numbers, and intense violence and use of chemical weapons, etc., in ways that really had not been seen in this country up until that point, in the way that it had been in that moment. Moving forward, also in the early 2000s, we saw a tremendous amount of federal law enforcement resource put into the so-called war on terror. And what that did was also target specifically not just people for a religious or political ideology, which those things are actually legal for the government to do. Here they are again, catch them doing illegal things. Because the reality is that the state makes the rules of engagement for repression, but they constantly change them. They constantly change them and they constantly ignore them. So while they can't, the New York Police Department, if you're on the Zoom, on the slide, there's a picture that says ancestries of interest. The New York NYPD, let alone the FBI, isn't really allowed to just say anyone from Egypt or anyone from Yemen is now a person of interest. And yet here you can see that that's absolutely what they have done and continue to do in this so-called war on terror. What happened in 2011 is really interesting because it's building on this history of private interest that was in reaction to the animal liberation and earth liberation struggles that I mentioned earlier. So private companies that have been targeted by activists and organizers started doing their own kinds of surveillance, right? And what we see now since Occupy is a much higher level of non-state actors that are doing so-called security, private security, or I guess like fulfilling the role of counterinsurgency, right? So some people might remember at Standing Rock, all of the things that came out about Tiger Swan in particular, which is a domestic private security firm that was operating there in tandem with official law enforcement agencies on the local and federal level, and was founded by the same person who started Blackwater, which has provided security and surveillance and counterinsurgency efforts in the war on terror overseas throughout the Middle East. And here we are now with the last nearly 4 years of our lives of Trump and this new normal. What we are going to dive into just briefly is kind of a case study of the new normal. So some people might remember that Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, 2017. And on that day, January 20th, 2017, what happened was, I'm actually going to stop my screen share here for a second on the Zoom. It's not super necessary. And there we go. What happened on that day is that there were a lot of different people from many different communities from all over the country, and also locally from the DC metro area, that were descending on the city of Washington, DC in protest against Trump's inauguration. And people were using a lot of different tactics for that. So what we're going to go over is kind of this J20 case study, like I was saying. And January 20th, 2017, people had descended on DC to protest Trump's inauguration, which is a super great reason for people to descend on the city of Washington, DC, because fuck Trump. But there were people using all kinds of different tactics, and there were all kinds of different marches and blockades and things that had been planned for that day. One of the things that had been called for was a anti-capitalist block, which was going to be just a march of people who were into and down with that idea. Not just fuck Trump, but also just fuck the whole damn thing, all of it. And a lot of people showed up to that. Thousands of people showed up to that. And a march occurred, and then some property destruction occurred during that march. And there were many windows smashed, and much later in the day, some people might remember that there was like a limo that said, "We the people," and that limo had been torched. That wasn't during the march, that was later in the day. But it's like probably the most iconic image of Trump's inauguration and the protests against it. So then what ended up happening with this march is that 200 plus people, I believe something more like 280 people, had been kettled, closed in by the police, and at the corners of L and 12 in DC. And then all those people were arrested. And then they were charged with the federal crime of rioting. But then they were also all charged with the federal crime of conspiracy to riot and some other charges. And the interesting thing about J20 and these collective charges that could have landed 200 plus people in jail or prison for up to 75 years. We have come up with the 5 things that we think are most valuable takeaways and are really relatable to this moment right now. The first thing about this case that's really remarkable was the rapid mobilization of collective defense. That started that day in the streets. Before people had been taken into custody, people were already rapidly mobilizing jail support, trying to figure out how to get their friends and their new friends out of jail in DC. And then there were also education efforts that were put together, communication structures put into place and deployed. And those communication structures that were put into place and deployed were put into place and deployed for people that actually had been from almost every single state in the country. just minus a handful of states. So people were really spread out everywhere of this 200 plus people. And a lot of them had never met each other, didn't know each other from anybody, and wouldn't have been able to pick one another out in a crowd and say, you were there with me. So trying to find all of those people and put them into these communication structures to develop shared values, to develop collective defense and solidarity amongst one another was a massive undertaking. And it happened really fast through people's strategic efforts. And I just want to give a special shout out to people who were involved with MAC in New York at the time, did a ton of legwork on that, and huge thanks to those folks. The second thing that is really notable about this case was the state's version of collectivity, which is collective culpability and punishment. Right now, we have this thing happening where there's the peaceful protester, and that's totally chill to protest. That's like your First Amendment rights, getting your constitutional vibe on. And then there's the rioter and the looter. And in J20, not dissimilarly, there were people the state had labeled as breakers. And then there were people that the state has labeled as everybody else. But it didn't matter if you were a breaker or if you were everybody else, because the state said that you were all culpable because you were all there. And their vision of collectivity is pretty twisted, surprise, surprise. And I think it's really useful for us to pick those things apart in this moment. How does that relate to what's happening to us in all of our many different communities right now? This good protester, bad protester thing that has come up before, and we know has been deployed by the federal government in the situation of riots or property destruction, in this way where even if you're just standing next to someone when they break a window, right, that you also are culpable for that. But what we don't want to do, and what we didn't want to do with J20, was let the state divide us like that and to be like, oh, well, those people were the ones breaking things, and I wasn't doing that. And I want to really caution all of us to learn from that solidarity effort, to really learn from saying, no, one of us is all of us, and we mean that in the good way, whereas the state is saying one of us, or one of you is all of you, and they mean it in this really nasty way that leads to people going to prison. So that's our first three: rapid mobilization of collective defense, the collective culpability and punishment version that the state deployed, this breaker versus walker, or breaker versus everybody else, good protester, bad protester. But then number 4 on our list is expansive support for defendants. And this is one of, I think, the parts of anti-repression and movement defense that I think it's easy for us to forget about in moments, and how vital it is. What it is, when we create support for people who are facing the harsh repercussions of the state through the legal system or otherwise, what we are able to do is build our resiliency. And when we build our resiliency, that's one of those things that Jay mentioned earlier that helps us to continue to carve out the space to meet our tactical goals. Our tactical goal is get fucking free. And we can't get fucking free if we're not taking care of each other. So movement defense is a term that I like to use versus anti-repression. But I also just like to highlight for people, that's a form of mutual aid, which I think is on a lot of people's minds right now with COVID and with this pandemic. It's a form of mutual aid. And if we don't work care into our efforts of anti-repression, they're gonna fall flat. And that expansive support for defendants wasn't just in the courtroom. It wasn't just when they were in jail, but it was also making sure that people had food in their refrigerators. It was making sure that people had access to therapy if they needed it, that somebody was able to give them a ride or help them get to court dates, or help them to get to the fucking mall for a mall pretzel if that's what they needed to feel better about their shit. And that's what I mean about really expansive support and deploying that. I mean mall pretzels for everybody. When it's safe to go to the mall again. And the last thing is number 5 in the case study of J20 is diversity of tactics did not end in the streets. People did not leave their value of a diversity of tactics at the corner of L and 12 in DC on January 20th, 2017. We continued those diversity of tactics in our legal support. We continued those diversity of tactics in the courtroom. We continued them in the media that we generated. There was never, ever a denunciation of someone having broken a window, even if the state could prove that shit. Who cares, right? Those are our comrades. And we supported that diversity of tactics in an ongoing way. Now, what I don't want people to be misled about or mistaken is that that shit is easy. A lesson of J20 that I think is really valuable for us right now, and a lesson from every one of those other historical movements that I've mentioned today, is that if we don't really hone in on care for one another and really digging into our relationships in meaningful ways, our movements will fail and people will be left behind in prison for decades. And we've seen that with movements of the past. And so this is what you do right now, caring for each other, taking time out of the day, that's gonna add up into a movement that's resilient and can be sustained. I've gone over my time. And so now we have Jay, who's gonna hop in on the IG Live and kind of bring us home, I would say.
Thank you for all that, Hava. I think sort of the sort of rounding out point that I want to make on the J20 part before I conclude entirely is that it was, you know, that rapid mobilization of mass defense, all those support efforts, you know, the really messy, complicated solidarity that people were able to maintain that allowed almost all 200 of those people to fight their cases for over a year, and almost all of them got dismissed. There was a lot of, you know, a lot of conflict and such that went on during that time, but people were able to, you know, maintain at least some level of solidarity without denouncing each other, without turning on each other, to give, you know, their lawyers and their legal teams the time that they needed to pick apart that case and just really demolish it into the ground. There were 2 trials that happened that resulted in no convictions, and then all the other remaining cases got dismissed as a result of uncovering the prosecution's misconduct. And so for how much resources that the prosecution and the state put into, you know, trying to convict 200 people of felony offenses for some broken windows, their efforts were, you know, incredibly unsuccessful. That's not to say that that case didn't still exact a tremendous toll on people, you know, emotionally, materially, politically. There's people that won't talk to each other anymore because of it. There is still a cost to victory, but the cost of defeat is obviously much greater. To sort of wrap up, I think there's sort of, I like to sort of end on, you know, talking less about what the state does and more about the things that we can do in our organizing, in our communities, in our movements to build that resiliency. And I've sort of distilled it into six points. And so I'll go through them really quickly. The first one is solidarity and support for the people and the groups that are targeted, not denouncing each other, working through our conflicts and our disagreements, offering, you know, whatever support we're able to, and, you know, always asking people what they need, what they want in that moment, whether, you know, Hava's example of a pretzel from the mall, whether it's a ride to get groceries, whether it's help cooking, emotional support, things, you know, whatever the case may be. People's needs are incredibly varied, and I think it's important to be responsive to all of those. Particularly people that are facing the harshest repression, but, you know, all of us in general, because like Em said earlier, repression is a constant force on us. And so in some ways, all of us are facing repression. Some people are facing it harsher than others because of particular legal cases or because of particular identities or communities that they're involved in. But all of us are being targeted in some ways because of our participation. And also recognizing that some of the people that we do support work are going to be people that we just don't like. And that's sort of a sad fact. Sometimes the state likes to go after the low-hanging fruit, and we see this person that's doing something careless and irresponsible, and we have to sort of put aside our criticisms and recognize that the state's victory against this person is also the state's victory against our movement. Point number 2, pretty simple, but silence to law enforcement. The only thing you should ever say to law enforcement is, I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to a lawyer. I do not consent to a search. Anything else that you say contributes to their intelligence gathering. It contributes to their social mapping. It contributes to breaking solidarity and building distrust as people start wondering who's talking with law enforcement. And it helps build investigations against people that we love, people that we know, people that we care about, and ourselves. This also includes not cooperating with grand juries. We could do a whole nother 3-hour presentation on grand juries, but we won't right now, some other time. Point number 3, security culture. I think this gets overhyped in some regards, talking about tech security, what you can and can't talk about. Basically, don't share information about illegal activities with anybody that you don't absolutely need to. This includes rumors, this includes gossip, this includes bragging, things like that. I think one of the obstacles that we have in our movement is this sort of macho culture of proving that, you know, we're radical, that we're committed, things of that sort. And I think it leads people to want to appear to be that sort of false ideal that we've created. And I think undermining that and creating, like Hava said, more culture of care and commitment and relation to one another, rather than just like who's been arrested the most times, who's broken the most windows, so on and so forth. And so getting back to that relational security point, without dismissing the importance of, you know, sort of physical tech security, but sort of supplementing it. Number four is skepticism about rumors and conjecture and conspiracy theories. The state is using a lot of conspiracy theories. I think we live in this time where conspiracies are very popular. They speak to people. They speak to this desire or this realization that something's wrong with an incomplete analysis. And I think it's important to sort of combat that conspiratorial thinking, that the conspiracies sometimes happen, but the conspiracy does not explain how the world works and does not explain these really complex social phenomena that are happening. And so spreading, you know, rumors, unverified information, I think is primarily a tool of our enemies rather than a tool of us. The counterpoint is point number 5, solid communication and bonds of trust. Really, again, that relational security component, really prioritizing accountability to one another, accountability to our communities and our movements, and, you know, building a high level of trust with the people that we're really organizing with. And then the final point is to keep organizing for our liberation, for our freedom, for what we want to see and what we want to build. This is the point that comes back to, you know, retaking the initiative, that we can't simply respond to their repression. We have to keep our vision central to our organizing and keep building towards that. And so that sort of concludes our presentation. I'm not sure how we want to handle Q&A type stuff, but we're very grateful for everybody that tuned in. And if you have questions, if you want more resources, please reach out to any of these groups that are involved, Stark, Tucson Anti-Repression, Austin ABC. And also today we just posted a series of infographics about anti-repression and resiliency strategies onto our Instagrams. So please take a look at those and share those also.
One of the questions, we'll start with this one that's on the Zoom. The question was, relationships are even harder right now to center with quarantine and COVID-19 concerns. and any suggestions for how to center care and relationships with one another while keeping COVID-19 precautions in mind. Of course, in some instances, getting out there regardless of the pandemic is important, but just for our general relationships, it's a consideration right now. Any ideas? I'll hop in with a little bit of a thought, and maybe others have something to add. It's a conversation that I think people where I'm at in Arizona are having, because, and have been having even just today. We're in a state right now where the COVID chart is literally going like this, like on the number of cases, since the governor reopened the state at the beginning of May. And one of the things that we're thinking about is how do we limit risk while also engaging in social struggle and maintaining our social relationships, which is exactly what this question is about. And it's not easy. Guess what? I've never done a pandemic before. And none of us have really done anything like this before. And it's really challenging. And I guess my advice is just to like be slow and be gentle, that so many times we have this feeling of urgency in our movements, and that urgency is real, but also being able to step back, even sometimes for like 10 minutes, and slow down enough to like catch your breath and center yourself before you respond to the urgent text message, before you respond to the urgent meeting or whatever. I think is going to give us the kind of resiliency we all went into this social struggle low on our resiliency reserves, I think, because of COVID. Those are my thoughts. Does anyone else want to hop in? Jay.
I think one piece that didn't get worked into this this presentation earlier, but I think is really important, is prisoner support and support for political prisoners. There's currently, I think, 51 federal indictments that are pending as a result of the last 2 weeks of uprisings. And I think it's, without a doubt, there's people that are going to prison, some of them for quite a while. And people have been doing prisoner support and political prisoner support for a long time. And I think there's a lot of lessons there about how to continue to maintain relationships across physical distance and across really significant and repressive barriers. And I don't have all the answers there, but people have managed to, organize uprisings and insurrections within the prison system through smuggled cell phones and through coded letters and through, other sort of clandestine communications. And so I don't want to, in some ways, I don't want to minimize the horror of prison or, directly compare, quarantine and social isolation to the prison atmosphere. But I also do think that there are parallels that are relevant, and taking lessons from our comrades that have been incarcerated, some of them for decades now, and the people that have been doing support work for those comrades is extremely valuable, and sort of centering that praxis as we move forward through this sort of social distancing. And, writing letters and, phone calls that are recorded by the state, and meeting with your loved ones through, plexiglass or while somebody's in handcuffs is never going to, be the same as like being able to hold somebody and like, being in the same space unconstrained with each other. But there is still a lot of possibility there for engagement and relationship building and creating connections that are valuable and meaningful and subversive to our current social order.
Did folks from Stark want to hop in at all?
I would just read some of the input that's been put here, but if someone else wants to, we've got like taking conversations slow, trying not to have intense conversations on large loops, phone calls rather than texting because you have a bit clearer communication. You don't have to be exposed to COVID, but also writing letters to each other. These are all things that have been submitted to us. Creating Zoom versions of rituals that you already had. That's a really good one. Or building new rituals if you have new, co-defendants. Thing like finding new ways that you can communicate with each other socially distanced and out of the ears of the state. Yeah.
Okay, another question we have in the Zoom is, can you talk about the outside agitator narrative and how we can address that as a movement? Well, I do have a brief thought, and then I'm sure everyone else has a thought on this as well. First, I want to say that, damn, the state's bag of tricks is so tired, y'all. Like, did they forget that we all were tweeting about that in 2014? I don't know if people saw in my slide on the Zoom, but there's a picture of a police officer holding up a rock with a bunch of people behind her at a press conference. That's from Minneapolis a few years ago when there was an occupation at a police precinct there, and they were trying to say that outside anarchists were the agitators. And then here they are again, just a handful of years later, using the same tired old shit. And it's so obvious and it's so tired that even the most like mainstream media outlets are writing about how tired it is. You could find it in the New York Times. You can find it on NPR, The Atlantic. There's like a whole fucking daily episode about it. It's a tired narrative. And so one of the goals of this workshop in particular is to show people, like I said before, these histories of repression and then our histories of resistance. If we don't know how the state has used repressive tools in the past, they always seem like big new scary tools again. And it's like we have to really center the history in these moments so that we are not doomed to like fall for it again. And it's a real fool me once moment, I think, to quote old George W. Anyone else?
So we just want to say we're synced to the Instagram, so we're like a little off from the Zoom because of our audio feedback. But yeah, I think that this narrative has obviously become incredibly prevalent. It's really evident that it's false for those people who are participating, and evident when we see protests that are emerging like in all 50 states and in many, many cities and small towns in all of those places, that it's just impossible for outside agitators to be there are just like so many levels of it's evident. But we had some good feedback in one of our Q&As here that was when people who are arrested inevitably have no connection to these so-called groups like Antifa, ugly anarchists, whatever the state is trying to portray as the cause behind this in order to obscure and ignore the the struggle for liberation of Black people and against the murder by police.
Yeah.
They are, and when it's evident that people who are facing charges are just regular people and they are supported by those of us who are engaged with like and invested in this continuing the struggle through the legal process, it's going to help to reveal that this isn't a false narrative. So thank you for the person who provided that.
Yeah, and something that I just wanted to say quickly is that I think like white supremacy often presents itself in this outside agitator narrative, especially during the George Floyd uprising. Like I'm seeing Antifa or like outside agitators or anarchists raced or like coded as white folks, and then people in community who like live in that space being coded as Black folks. And I think it places so much power and control with the idea that white people are coming in and choosing what these movements in the street look like. And I just wanted to speak to, I often think that's popping up inside of the outside agitator narrative is a lot of whiteness.
One other thing I want to hit on this topic is that specifically, I'll use the example of Standing Rock, because I think we're in a moment that could look not so dissimilar, but just on this national level when it comes to the state's repression tactics. So at Standing Rock, there was also this this repression tactic of the outside agitator, specifically the white anarchist coming and like making Native people do what they wanted them to do, which one, like Elle was saying, takes away those people's agency, which is really rooted in some fucked up shit. That it says that people, one, wouldn't know how to resist if they didn't have someone white telling them how to do it, but then also that it delegitimizes their choice of how they resist, right? And that's intentional on the part of the repressive force in that effort. But the state is also and our opposition is also, they're not dum-dums all the time. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're really not. And they're not in knowing that if the people who they choose to go down the hardest on the worst charges are people of color. In the instance of Standing Rock, all of the people who had resulting federal convictions and prison time were all Native. And that's not necessarily because the state had the greatest cases against them, I don't imagine. It's, I think also, and I think we can infer that it's a really powerful tool of division, right? Because what happened at Standing Rock was it was many different movements coming together and converging around an issue in an incredibly powerful way that had not happened previously, around an issue of land defense and against extraction, that tens of thousands of people came together from a lot of different movements and backgrounds. And that's really powerful. And right now what we see happening is that many different people from many different backgrounds and identities and experiences are coming together, one, for Black liberation, two, for a movement against the police, and three, to get the fuck free for everybody. And that's really powerful. And it's a huge threat, not just to the police and their funding, it's a huge threat to capitalism and power structures that are ruining our lives. And so that comment that somebody put that Em just shared is really important, that right now we deploy really strong movement defense for people who are going down on charges and that are facing, there's an article in the Times today, the New York Times, that said out of the 51 federal charges resulting from these recent protests that exist in this moment, thus far, none of them fit the like Antifa outside agitator narrative, right? And so here the state is pulling another one of its tired old tricks out of its tired old bag. And we should be ready to respond to that with really excellent movement support.
Yeah, just really quickly, one other insight that was put into our chat was that this could be related to like long running white nationalist ideas of Jews being the puppeteers of the left. This is like the Soros narrative of paid protesters, and that anti-Semitism is a part of this outside agitator narrative, and that's true. And also, this is another time when not only our recent history with the 2014 anti-police murder uprisings and Standing Rock are relevant, but history going back to like slave rebellion is relevant, and where the outside agitator narrative there are some articles being published right now that trace outside agitator narratives all the way back to where Northerners were accused of coming down to agitate and create slave rebellions, which is, you know, something that has happened right here in Richmond. When we know that it was not the case. It was led by Gabriel, and other enslaved people who rose up. So definitely this is another time when history can really be to our advantage here and show the powerful ways that we have defended ourselves in the past.
In the meantime, while people think of any last minute questions they might have, I just want to point out, Jay mentioned about grand juries, there's already an online resource for a grand jury workshop that's available through CrimeThink. If you just Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever it is you're into doing, grand jury resistance CrimeThink, think with a C, you're gonna find it, and it's on a Vimeo, and it's a lasting thing that you can watch with your buds. And the other thing that I want to mention for folks is, we said this at the beginning and I want to like drive it home again, is that there's no intention for anyone to ever have a monopoly on any of this knowledge. And the framework or like structure for this workshop was put together also in tandem with like a train the trainer curriculum that goes with it, and a reading list, and all of these other resources, because we want for people to be able to adapt this and do it in their own communities, right? And to be able to have conversations in the Q&A and discussion time that you can't have like on a Zoom call, and you can't have with people that you don't have like relationships of trust with necessarily, even if it's just you don't feel super comfortable in that format, right? And so if people are interested in finding out information about that, how to get access to that, or if people want to do like an online train the trainer kind of thing, what I'm going to ask you to do is slide into the Tucson Anti-Repression Instagram DMs, get up in our DMs and let us know. And folks that have been participating today, Jay, L, and a lot of our other comrades who do this type of work across the country would love to make that happen. And I just want to say that like it's very warming, because J and M are two of those, or not J and M and L are two of those people that that I personally like worked with in sharing this information and workshop stuff with, and they've been using that in their community for years now. And so it's like really awesome to see that coming into this moment together and get to do it together, which is really tight. It looks like maybe there's a couple more questions. So one of the questions is, do you have any good suggestions for calling out and dealing with these outside agitators when we spot them? Someone with a bullhorn calling them out. I'm not totally sure, like, I'm not totally certain what they mean, but do you mean like an undercover cop outside agitator? Like maybe that person might want to type a little bit more into their box, their question box, but it also seemed like Jay had something that they wanted to add, and I'm gonna pop you into the Instagram Live.
I think this is actually a really sort of important point, and gets to something that's, you know, messy and complicated, but incredibly destructive, is this idea of finding out who the agitator is, who's the informant, who's the snitch, who's the undercover cop. And it creates this environment where we're all sort of suspicious of each other and accusing each other of bad motives and bad this and bad that. And what I would posit is that what we should not be doing is questioning people's motives. If people are acting in a way that's unsafe, that's dangerous, that's disruptive, I think it's important to address that behavior, to be like, hey, this behavior is disruptive, this behavior is dangerous, you're creating an unsafe situation for people, and address it based on the behavior. They could be, you know, honest and misguided. They could be, you know, a little too exuberant. They could be disruptive for any number of reasons. And the problem here is that when you start accusing people of being sort of malicious actors, whether it's an infiltrator or a cop, you know, agitator, it focuses not on what they were doing that was harmful, but who they are and what their character is. And this is sort of the wrong approach to it. And I've personally been involved in two situations where individuals that were honest, hardworking, good faith activists got what's called snitch jacketed, accused of being informants or cops. And the first time that happened, it was not I don't think it was entirely on purpose, but we were trying to find out some background information about this person. We were not very discreet or careful about how we were doing it. And so it started this rumor that kind of got out of our hands. And this person basically got burned out of a number of activist scenes because this rumor took off that they were an undercover, they were a snitch. The other time, I think it was more, it was a little bit more explicit. And I also think that the state was actually involved in trying to make this person look like they were an informant. And it was also, somebody that's, still very dear to me, that got accused of being an informant in this situation. When it turned out that the person that actually was the informant was the person that was sort of helping accuse this person of being the informant. And we've seen that, Javier was talking about the American Indian movement, and there's some really, really insidious examples of that took place where people that infiltrated the movement would start spreading allegations that other people were informants. And the level of repression that the movement was facing from the state created this really hyper guarded and almost paranoid environment where those accusations were really able to take root. And so I think it's important to keep in mind how repression changes how we think about situations and how it sort of colors our view of certain situations in a way that we start seeing repression where it might not actually exist. And to go back a little bit to the one situation where we actually did have an informant in our organizing in our community, somebody by the name of Brandon Darby. The biggest lesson there was that he had this long history of really abusive, disruptive, manipulative, damaging behavior. And even to this day, I know a lot of people that sort of argue and speculate about how long he had been working for the FBI, how long he had been working for the state. But the bottom line is that he should not have been in our movements anyway because of the harm and the damage that he had caused, regardless of what his intention behind that was. Even if he really was, a revolutionary or whether he was an informant, if somebody's causing harm, that harm needs to be addressed. And if somebody continues to cause that harm or causes significant harm, it doesn't matter what their motivation is. That's something that needs to be addressed. And sometimes people have to be removed from communities and spaces in order to keep them safe. And so to sort of summarize, I think it's important to really focus on people's behavior and not speculate or spread rumors or focus or attach onto ideas about what their motives are, who they are as people.
I think to kind of just wind us down, I want to thank all of the different folks who have participated and carved out time out of everything that's going on around you to participate in this today. All of our lives before this uprising began across the country were already really wild because of the COVID-19 situation. And all of us in our communities are doing so much like care work and survival work. And then we're also trying to both get free and help other people get free and stay free on top of that. And I just can't imagine a more charming way for me to start my Shabbat. 2 weeks ago, people started Shabbat by kindling, maybe it was 3 weeks ago now, what's time? But people started their Shabbat by kindling cop cars and saying that we don't need police. And may we all our Shabbats look like that. I also just want to say, because I think book recs are always important, if you were going to read any one book that I think was going to prepare you to really engage in movement defense in this moment, I just think that Emergent Strategy is the shit. This book is pretty game-changing for folks and has so much important information about building our resiliency as individuals, but also within our movements. And I think is really key to anti-repression work, that we build our resiliency. and we build our capacity to continue to achieve our goal, which is total liberation for all the people and other animals and the earth. So working on it. Yeah, I see you up in the chat on the Zoom. Shabbat shalom, bitches. And I hope to see all of you on the other side. And if you have feedback or questions or comments or whatever, feel free to hop into our DMs through Tucson Anti-Repression on Instagram. If you're on the East Coast, Stark is a really awesome resource. If you're in the South, Austin, ABC is an awesome resource as far as prisoner support stuff goes and other types of movement defense. So again, thanks so much, y'all, and catch you on the flip side.